Hi everyone. We're going to talk about the tabernacle and dive into understanding its layout and the different components that make up the tabernacle. Now this will be important for videos that are coming up to understand this first. So this is kind of like foundational. So let's get into it. Okay, so basically in the time of Moses was instructed to create a tabernacle or a tent of meeting. So this tabernacle had very specific requirements to how it was to be built, and it was designed to be set up and packed up, which was undertaken by the Levites. Okay, so the Levites were priests. There were 3 sons of Levi. All right, so we see the sons of Korah. Okay, they were responsible for the vessels used in the tabernacle and the screen. Okay, I believe that might be that goes around the tabernacle. Gershon, that was responsible for the curtains and the veils of the enclosure. Merari were responsible for the walls of the tabernacle and the pillars of the enclosure. Okay, so obviously we need pillars to prop it up. To prop up the tabernacle. We need the coverings, various coverings, and then there was this area on the outside. This is called the outer court. And so, for example, we had the brazen altar of sacrifice. Okay, the brazen altar of sacrifice, and we're going to play a video which will cover this, but I just wanted to give you a heads up on what to pay attention to. So the brazen altar of sacrifice has 4 horns on it. And it basically was where the sacrifices would take place. Okay, we see in the Bible 4 horns usually represent 4 forms of power or 4 kingdoms. And so we have that. Inside we have the menorah, the veil, which separates the holy place, which this main section was known as the holy place. So only the priests are allowed to enter in here. Only the high priest could enter in through the veil once a year, okay, into the Holy of Holies, which is where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. So we had the altar of incense. It still had the same layout, so with the horns on the outside, the table with the showbread, and other vessels. So essentially what happened was, we're talking today about the Solomon's temple. So there was the tabernacle. This is like the mobile version that was set up and taken down. Okay. It's believed, before we talk about Solomon's temple, that David's son Solomon built, we see here this correlation between the Garden of Eden. Okay, so many believe that the Garden of Eden was kind of the prototype for the tabernacle. Or there's a correlation between the Garden of Eden and the tabernacle. So Jewish tradition concludes that the Garden of Eden was located on top of a hill. The tree of life and the tree of knowledge and good and evil were in the center of the hill. Okay, so when Adam and Eve were cast out, they were cast out to the east. Okay, which is the direction that this faces to the east. Okay, the tabernacle was set up in an east to west direction, replicating the Garden of Eden. So we see the trees, and it's set up in the direction of pointing to east. And we see the cherubim here were guarding, with the flaming sword, were guarding the entrance. Okay. We see that Solomon's temple was likely built on top of the protruding rock, which is Mount Moriah. Okay, so we're in 2 Chronicles chapter 3. It starts to talk about Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, okay, in Mount Moriah. All right, so, and we see this is the actual location of where, on this mount, at Mount Moriah, this protruding rock was where Abraham was led to sacrifice Isaac, his son. But he was stopped before that occurred, obviously. Okay, so what happened? So we believe that we've got this rock on Mount Moriah, okay, up on the hill. Okay. Solomon basically built his temple on top of that, we believe. and then he built a palace next to it. Then it extended the walls around the city. All right. So one really interesting thing about this whole thing, why this is important, the outer court represents the fallen world. Okay. So the outer court is kind of like earth, if you will, or all of us in this world that we're in. Okay, we're outside of the temple. Now the temple, if the temple's within us, the temple becomes likened to our journey. Okay, our journey through faith. So if we look at how that works, we start off in the outer court in the fallen world. Okay, and in order to enter into the temple, it requires that faith. It requires all of those things. So, we're saved from that outer world, and then we start to enter through the temple and become more and more holy. So the first section is called the holy place, and the next section is the Holy of Holies. Okay, so we see as the priest enters through, and we'll see in the video, he leaves the outer world. He does so and enters a more holy state, much like our salvation. Then he's able to re-enter into the presence of the Lord. Okay? It's pretty profound. It's amazing. Like, I've only recently just understood this. But that's the significance of the temple. So you think about the temples within you. You have your own temple that was, set up when you were your own tabernacle. Okay, that was set up when you were saved. And that your journey is that journey of becoming holy. It's going through that temple. Now, what happens if something defiles the temple? Okay, that's what I believe we read about in some of the prophecies like Daniel, with the abomination that makes the temple desolate, all right? And so, obviously that's a problem. Okay, so having a look at Solomon's temple, and we'll watch the video, but it goes quickly, so you might miss some of these key points. Okay, so we have the brazen altar of sacrifice in Solomon's temple, replicating the same as the tabernacle. We've got the 4 horns representing power or kingdoms. We have the molten or brazen sea, which it's resting on top of the backs of 12 oxen facing north, south, east, and west, compassed about. Okay. The oxen generally represent strength, and they refer to, in these positions, the 12 tribes of Israel. So water was poured from this brazen sea, into 10 water basins on the sides of the temple, okay, which could then be wheeled around and used for rituals and washing by the priests. Okay, I haven't quite established, any correlations with these yet. But it will be interesting to see how that works. Okay, so there's storage rooms on the southwest, north sides of the temple. There were three chambers, so 3 floors. Okay, they had a stepped design that allowed the timber to rest on the steps. There was a door on the south side of the temple that allowed you to get into these storage rooms. So we see that the timber rests on these steps. It's quite clever. And then wooden ladders led up to each floor that you could climb up. Okay, there were 2 large bronze pillars at the front of the temple. One was called Boaz on the left, and Yashin on the right. Yakin, I'm not sure how to say it, but J is usually a Y in our pronunciation. The tops of these pillars were decorated with lily flower petals and pomegranates. And we read in the Bible reference to, "I'll make you a pillar in my temple." I believe it's in Revelation when it's talking about the churches. So the pomegranates and the lily flower. So the pomegranates represent prosperity and posterity. So the many seeds. And we also see the bottom hem of the clothing of the high priest. The pomegranates are on as well, with the golden bells. Okay, so we have the main doors of the temple. They're covered in cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. So palm trees represent salvation. So we see Hosanna. When Jesus enters into Jerusalem on the donkey. They're basically saying, "Please save us, be our salvation." And so then we have the open flowers and the cherubim as well. So Bible describes the door as being a fourth part of the wall, which is interesting. It has 4-step door frames in it. So it's like 4 frames. It kind of steps into 4 layers. And the Holy of Holies has 5 frames instead of 4. Okay, so that's the basic structure of the tabernacle, and then the going into Solomon. This is Solomon's temple here. So let's watch a video and just understand from the start. Now, just a disclaimer, I disagree with the height that they've ruled here in this video, because when you go to the scriptures it says something different. So I don't know how they're getting their height, but when I add it up, it doesn't add up to me. So anyway, I'll cover that in later videos.
Solomon's temple stood in Jerusalem for almost 400 years. It was the crown jewel of Jerusalem and the center of worship to the Lord. Almost half of the Old Testament writings took place during the time when Solomon's temple was still standing. Understanding the significance of its location, history, and design can greatly add to one's reverence for one of the most holy places in the world. The city of Jerusalem is located in an area of 3 major valleys: the Hinnom, the Central or Tyropian, and the Kidron Valley. The mountain range between the Central and Kidron Valley is called Mount Moriah. The peak of the mountain is a large protruding flat rock, which is now located under the dome of the rock. According to Genesis 22:2, Abraham was commanded to sacrifice Isaac in the region of Moriah, connecting the Temple Mount with this significant event. At the time of King David, the area of Jerusalem was controlled by the Jebusites, the city only occupying the southern part of the central ridge. When David captured the city in about 1000 BC, he made Jerusalem his capital. David then moved the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and began preparations for building a permanent structure to replace the portable tabernacle of Moses that had been used for over 400 years. With the ancient city of Jerusalem being fairly small, David purchased the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite so he could expand the size of the city. Being higher than the city of David, the hilltop would make a beautiful place to build the temple of the Lord. Under the reign of David's son, King Solomon, the temple construction began. After 7 years of construction in about 960 BC, Solomon finished building the temple, most likely built over this same protruding rock of Mount Moriah. Solomon also built himself a new palace just south of the temple and expanded the walls of the city up towards the peak of Mount Moriah. The Temple of Solomon was modeled after the Tabernacle of Moses. Because of the many similarities between the Tabernacle and the Garden of Eden, many scholars believe that the Garden of Eden was the prototype for the Tabernacle, and thus later temples. According to Jewish tradition, Eden was located on a hill, with the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil at the center of the hill. The Bible teaches that when Adam and Eve transgressed and partook of the forbidden fruit, they were cast out towards the east. Cherubim and a flaming sword were then placed at the east entrance to prevent them from partaking of the tree of life, as they would then live forever in their sin. In order to return back into the presence of God, Israel had to symbolically retrace the steps of Adam and Eve, passing the cherubim and re-entering the garden in a westward direction. The tabernacle was set up in the same east-to-west progression, seeming to replicate the Garden of Eden. The tabernacle was divided into 3 main courts: the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. The outer court represented the fallen world, while the inner courts represented a more sacred and holier way of life. In essence, as the priest, who represented all of Israel, progressed through the tabernacle, or temple, he left the world to enter a more holy state, and then was enabled to re-enter the presence of the Lord, passing the angels, or cherubim who were embroidered on the veil. Solomon's temple replicated this same three-level progression, doubling the floor plan size of the tabernacle's sanctuary for the temple structure. As one approached the Temple of Solomon, the first thing noticed was the brazen altar of sacrifice. The altar was 20 cubits long and wide and 10 cubits high, a cubit being the length from the elbow to the tip of the longest finger, or about 1.5 feet. On the four corners of the altar were 4 horns, horns often representing power. This is where the sacrificial animals were burned, representing the future sacrifice of the Savior Jesus Christ. On the southeast side of the temple was the molten or brazen sea, which rested on the backs of 12 oxen, 3 pointing in each of the cardinal directions. In ancient times, oxen represented strength, and the number 12 often represented the 12 tribes of Israel. Water from the larger brazen sea was poured into 10 bronze water basins on both sides of the temple, which could then be wheeled around the outer court for various washing and cleansing rituals by the priests. Around the south, west, and north sides of the temple were 3 floors of chambers or storage rooms. The inside wall of the chambers was stepped so as to create a ledge where the timbers of the floors could rest. The storage rooms were accessed by a door on the south side of the temple, with wooden ladders going up into each of the floors. At the front of the temple were 2 large bronze pillars that flanked the porch. The pillar on the left was named Boaz, and the pillar on the right was named Yakin. The tops were decorated with lily flower petals and pomegranates. Pomegranates were a sign of prosperity and posterity because of their many seeds, and were also found on the bottom hem of the clothing of the high priest. The main temple doors were made of 2 large bifolding doors covered in gold with cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. The Bible describes the doorframe as being a 4th part of the wall, which most scholars believe means that the door had 4 stepped frames. The interior doorway of the Holy of Holies was similar, except having 5 frames instead of 4. The priests who represented Israel were the only ones allowed into the inner temple. This means that Israel only could enter through being represented by the priests. Once you entered the main doors, you entered the holy place, a large room 40 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits tall. The room was overlaid with gold and decorated with cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, possibly alluding to the beauty of the Garden of Eden. The room was lit by 10 large menorahs, 5 on each side of the room, that were constantly burning, and narrow windows on each side of the top of the room. On the right side of the room.
Alright, so I'm just going to stop it there for a minute and just show you that in the scripture, okay, that we see the breadth of the house was 20 cubits and the height was 120, okay? It's talking about the porch. Now, the porch was 120. If that's 30, that's a mistake. It can't be correct. There's no other height measurement here, even when you divide things or muck around, that you can achieve 30. I can't see it anywhere. Forgive me if I'm incorrect, but I spotted that straight away. And also something else that I've looked at and discovered with the maths, it doesn't add up if it's 30 anyway. Doesn't make sense. So I don't know how they're getting that, but everything else is bang on and a really good explanation. So I'll continue on.
Was located the table of showbread, which had 12 large flat pita-like loaves. The priests ate and then replaced the showbread every Sabbath, similar to our weekly partaking of the communion or sacramental bread. Breaking bread and sharing a meal with someone in ancient times represented that you were at peace with them and was a sign of brotherhood, love, and forgiveness. Directly in front of the Holy of Holies was the altar of incense. The altar was similar to the altar of sacrifice in that it had a square footprint and also had 4 horns, 1 on each of the corners. However, on the altar of sacrifice was burned the flesh of animals, while upon the altar of incense burned a sweet combination of incenses. The incense burning before the veil of the temple represented the prayers of the saints ascending to God before the veil, a reminder that before we can enter God's presence, our lives, prayers, and actions must become a sweet savor unto the Lord. Only the high priest was able to enter the Holy of Holies, and only on one day a year, the Day of Atonement. Before entering, the high priest passed through a beautifully embroidered veil woven from purple, red, blue, and white threads. The colors were the same as used in the ephod and breastplate of the clothing of the high priest, minus the gold thread. Embroidered on the veil were cherubim, who symbolically guarded the dwelling place of God. As the high priest passed through the veil, he had to pass these angels, who, like in the Garden of Eden, guarded the way back to the presence of the Lord. Upon entering the Holy of Holies, you would find that the room is in the shape of a perfect cube, being 20 cubits wide, long, and tall. The walls were likewise overlaid with gold and decorated with cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. 2 large cherubim flanked the Ark of the Covenant, which was in the center of the room, with their wings stretching from one side of the room to the other. This room is where the presence of the Lord would dwell, and represented the final goal and destiny of all Israel. Solomon's temple was not only a landmark for the city of Jerusalem, but more importantly, the dwelling place of the Lord. The layout represented Israel's progression back into God's presence and was designed to teach Israel that it was only through the infinite sacrifice of the sinless Messiah that they could once again enjoy the presence of the Lord. A sacrifice that would be performed on a cross only a short distance from this holy mountain.
All right, so it's a really good intro into the tabernacle. It's, probably it's the best video I've been able to find just to allow you to understand it really quickly without having to dive through and piece it all together. I think it does it justice. And the real takeaway for me is the journey. So it's the journey along. We know that the temple is within us. Okay, that we are the temple. Okay, that we are a temple and we're a house in His holy city, a spiritual New Jerusalem. Okay, so when we're building for God, we're building that house, we're building that temple, we're progressing into that journey from the world all the way through into reestablishing our connection with God. So it's as I sort of dive into this more, it's just opening up more and more different areas in which to study. So I hope this helps you guys. God bless and have a wonderful day or night wherever you are. Maranatha.